Amara Johnson's heart raced as the plane descended into chaos. A businessman accused her of stealing his wallet, and even Captain Hartley, a man with an air of superiority, joined in, demanding she cooperate. But when Amara, poised and unshaken, said one simple sentence, the room fell silent. Her words weren't just about defending herself. They were a challenge to the authority that had unjustly targeted her. As the tension reached its peak, the truth was finally revealed, and the whole cabin was left stunned. But before we dive deeper into this shocking tale, tell me where you're watching this story from in the comments below. And if you love this story, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a thrilling new chapter. Amara Johnson adjusted her navy suit jacket, her polished appearance as much a shield as it was a statement. The soft hum of the aircraft engines resonated in the cabin, a steady rhythm that contrasted sharply with the tension simmering in her chest. She didn't let it show, of course. Years as the public relations director for the airline had taught her the art of composure. Her responsibilities ranged from addressing crises to evaluating operations, and today's mission, evaluating the customer service on this flight, was routine. At least, it was supposed to be. She glanced at her understated gold watch, another 2 hours to her destination. From her window seat in first class, Amara had a clear view of the cabin's quiet activity. The murmured conversations, the occasional laughter, and the clink of glasses being served by a flight attendant all created a serene atmosphere. But Amara didn't miss the subtle details. The flight attendant's tight smile didn't quite reach her eyes. A businessman in the corner was already grumbling about the temperature, and a couple in the aisle seemed to be glaring at the overhead bin as if it had personally wronged them. Her thoughts wandered back to the reports that had crossed her desk. Complaints about rude staff, inattentive service, and, in one instance, an alleged confrontation between a crew member and a passenger. She had brushed off some of the claims as exaggerated, but knew that perception was often as important as reality in her line of work. Let's see if these complaints about the crew are valid, she mused, her gaze sharp and observant. This wasn't just about performance metrics. It was about ensuring the airline maintained its reputation in an industry where one bad review could spiral into a PR nightmare. The man seated beside her shifted, pulling her attention. He offered a polite smile, one she returned with a nod before redirecting her focus. This wasn't a social excursion. It was an opportunity to see the operation from a passenger's perspective, unfiltered, unannounced, and, ideally, insightful. "This is routine, no need to worry," she murmured under her breath, her voice calm as if reassuring herself. But deep down, she had learned that routine often carried the potential for the unexpected, and today she had a strange feeling that this flight would be anything but ordinary. The low murmur of conversation and the occasional clink of glasses filled the first-class cabin, creating an air of quiet luxury. Amara's eyes flicked from one passenger to another, her practiced gaze noting every detail: the meticulous fold of a flight attendant's uniform, the polite but rushed way drinks were served, the impatient tapping of a passenger's fingers on the armrest. She logged it all mentally, a silent observer with an important job to do. Then, the cabin door to the cockpit opened, and a presence disrupted the serene atmosphere. Captain William Hartley stepped into the room, his strides purposeful, his uniform immaculate. His tall frame and square shoulders carried an undeniable authority, but there was something about him that immediately caught Amara's attention. His sharp blue eyes scanned the cabin like a predator, surveying its domain. And when they landed on her, a flicker of something, disdain, perhaps, crossed his face. Amara stiffened but maintained her composure. Years in the corporate world had taught her how to remain unshaken under scrutiny. Still, the subtle shift in his expression didn't escape her notice. She'd seen that look before, the kind that dismissed her as soon as it saw her. A blend of arrogance and bias masquerading as professional detachment. Captain Hartley cleared his throat. his voice booming enough to silence the low chatter. "Good afternoon, folks," he announced, his tone smooth but rehearsed, like a politician delivering a stump speech. "We'll be departing shortly. Thank you for flying with us." His words hung in the air, polite yet devoid of warmth. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. The passengers offered polite nods and murmurs of acknowledgement, but Amara could sense the undercurrent of his performance. It was hollow, mechanical, a man going through the motions of professionalism without the authenticity to back it. Her mind sharpened, instincts kicking in. Something feels off about him, she thought, her gaze trailing him as he moved through the cabin. She couldn't yet put her finger on it, but her instincts rarely failed her. There was a stiffness in his posture, a superiority in the way he carried himself. Even his attempts to acknowledge the passengers felt more like an obligation than genuine courtesy. Cautious enough to ignore it, Hartley paused a few rows ahead, exchanging pleasantries with a businessman seated near the aisle. His tone remained clipped, and the interaction ended quickly, almost brusquely. Amara tilted her head slightly, her interest piqued. This wasn't typical behavior for a captain. A good leader knew the importance of building trust, of projecting confidence and approachability. Hartley, on the other hand, seemed more intent on asserting dominance. As he turned back toward the cockpit, their eyes met again, if only for a second. His expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened, and then he was gone, disappearing behind the cabin door without another word. There was something oddly gentle about the bow as it went out. Amara exhaled quietly, glancing out the window as the aircraft began its slow taxi to the runway. The calm rhythm of the flight had already been disrupted, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the last time it would happen. Hartley's presence lingered in her mind like a storm cloud on the horizon. She sat back in her seat, her fingers lightly gripping the armrest as her thoughts swirled. Stay sharp, she reminded herself. This was no ordinary flight, and she had a growing sense that the turbulence ahead wouldn't come from the skies. She carefully altered her course to remain opposite the lower beacon, though she had to content herself with whatever uproar came from it. The flight had settled into a quiet rhythm as the attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks. Amara sipped her water, her pen hovering over her notepad as she jotted a few observations. She was mid-thought when a sudden, sharp exclamation broke through the peace. "My wallet!" a man's voice boomed, tinged with panic. Heads turned as the businessman in the aisle seat a few rows ahead fumbled through his briefcase and pockets, his movements frantic. "It's gone. I had it before boarding." The energy in the cabin shifted instantly. Passengers exchanged uncertain glances, some leaning forward to get a better look at the commotion. Amara's pen stilled in her hand as she watched, her body tense, but her expression calm. The businessman, a balding man in his 50s wearing a tailored suit, continued his search, patting his jacket and checking his briefcase again. His face was red with frustration, his voice growing louder with each word. "It's not here. Someone took it." A flight attendant approached cautiously, her smile strained. "Sir, I understand you're upset. Could you please check under your seat? Sometimes things can slip out without us noticing." "I've checked," he snapped, his tone sharp enough to make the young woman flinch. "It's not under my seat. Someone here stole it." His gaze darted around the cabin, landing momentarily on each passenger as if sizing them up. When his eyes stopped on Amara, they lingered. Her calm demeanor seemed to ignite something in him, as if her lack of reaction was incriminating. "It's her!" he declared, pointing an accusatory finger in Amara's direction. The tension in the cabin spiked as all eyes turned to her. "She took it. I know it's her." Amara's chest tightened, but she maintained her poise. She set her pen down deliberately, her expression neutral as she met his gaze. "Excuse me?" she said, her tone steady, but with a hint of steel. "You were sitting there the whole time. The businessman continued, his voice rising. "It has to be you. I know I had my wallet before boarding. Now it's gone, and you're the only one who's been quiet this whole time, affecting a world without words in the brain to read it. How can something happen so unquiet?" The flight attendant intervened, her voice shaky but polite. "Sir, I assure you, we will do everything we can to assist, but let's not jump to conclusions." Perhaps. "Don't tell me not to jump to conclusions," he interrupted. "I've been robbed." Amara took a slow breath, willing herself to stay calm. She could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, some curious, others uncomfortable. The accusation hung in the air, thick and heavy. She chose her words carefully, keeping her tone measured. "Sir," she began, "I understand you're upset, but I would appreciate it if you didn't make baseless accusations. I haven't moved from my seat since I boarded." Her calm response only seemed to enrage him further. "Of course you deny it," he shouted. "You're trying to cover your tracks." The flight attendant looked helplessly at Amara, then back at the businessman. "Please, sir," she pleaded. "Let's take a moment to calm down. I'll help you look for your wallet." But the businessman was relentless, his anger fueling his determination. "Check her bag," he demanded, pointing again at Amara. "If she didn't take it, she has nothing to hide." Amara's jaw tightened, but she refused to let him see her rattle. She crossed her legs and leaned back slightly, her expression one of quiet defiance. "I suggest," she said, her voice cool and unwavering, "that you search your belongings again before making further accusations. And I recommend you treat me, and everyone else on this flight, with respect." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, an uneasy mix of speculation and discomfort. The flight attendant glanced toward the cockpit, silently willing someone to intervene. The tension in the cabin was thick, the businessman's anger clashing with Amara's calm resistance. As the situation escalated, Amara caught herself thinking, this isn't just about a wallet. This is about control, about someone feeling entitled to cast blame without evidence. She could feel the moment slipping towards something more significant, something that could shift the flight's entire dynamic. The businessman's gaze bore into her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she prepared herself for whatever might come next. The commotion in the first-class cabin had reached a boiling point. Passengers whispered among themselves, some craning their necks to get a better view. The businessman, still red-faced and livid, stood in the aisle, gesturing emphatically toward Amara. The young flight attendant looked overwhelmed, her efforts to defuse the situation falling flat against the man's relentless anger. Then, the cabin door opened and Captain Hartley stepped into the scene. His tall, commanding frame and crisp uniform seemed to momentarily quiet the murmurs. With a practiced air of authority, he assessed the situation, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as they darted between the businessman and Amara. "What seems to be the problem here?" Hartley asked, his tone firm yet impatient. The businessman wasted no time. "Captain, this woman stole my wallet," he declared, pointing an accusatory finger at Amara. "I had it before boarding, and now it's gone. She's the only one who could have taken it." This was passed over much simmering discussion, and they all started walking again. Hartley's gaze shifted to Amara, his expression unreadable, but his stance rigid. Amara met his eyes without flinching, her calm demeanor standing in stark contrast to the chaos around her. The tension between them crackled in the air like a storm about to break. "Ma'am," Hartley began, his voice clipped, "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. We need to check your belongings." Amara tilted her head slightly, her face remaining composed, though her mind raced. She had anticipated challenges on this flight, but this blatant targeting was beyond what she'd expected. She straightened in her seat, her voice steady as she replied, "Excuse me, Captain. Are you accusing me of theft?" Hartley's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "I didn't say that," he said, his tone sharpening. "But we need to rule everyone out." cooperation would be appreciated. We wouldn't have to. Politics has become so corrupted that impossible. Agreed. Constance flushed from the cold water in her eyes. I can see that. Amara's eyes narrowed slightly, her tone firm but controlled. I see. And what evidence do you have to single me out? She asked, each word deliberate, her voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. Or is this simply because I happen to be sitting quietly while others are panicking? Despandora arrodacio, vendescaro, senora, the elder man answered. A faint murmur rippled through the cabin as a few passengers exchanged glances, recognizing the weight of her question. Hartley's face hardened, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, as if her words had struck a nerve. I'm just following protocol, he said curtly, though his voice lacked conviction. Amara leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady and unyielding. Then I suggest, she said quietly, her tone carrying an unmistakable warning, that you ensure the protocol you are following is proper. Targeting a passenger without cause is not only inappropriate, it's unethical. The guard glanced at Nell and made a confiscating noise. The cabin fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Hartley's posture stiffened, his authority challenged in a way he clearly hadn't anticipated. The businessman fidgeted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in dynamics but unwilling to back down. That's just a surprise, Hartley snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. This doesn't have to be a big deal. Just cooperate, and we can all move on. Amara raised an eyebrow, her voice unwavering as she replied, Cooperate with what, exactly? Baseless accusations? Or the assumption that my presence here is inherently suspicious? Hartley opened his mouth to respond, but was momentarily at a loss for words. The flight attendant, still clutching her clipboard, glanced nervously between them, clearly unsure how to proceed. Finally, Amara spoke again, her tone softer but no less resolute. Captain, she said, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his growing irritation. I've worked in this industry long enough to recognize when someone is acting out of bias rather than reason. If you insist on pursuing this, I suggest you proceed with care. I won't tolerate being treated unfairly. Her words landed with a weight that silenced even the businessman, who now shifted awkwardly, avoiding her gaze. Hartley, however, stood his ground, though the cracks in his composure were starting to show. The tension was palpable, the passengers holding their collective breath as they waited to see what would happen next. Amara sat back slightly, her posture one of quiet defiance. She wasn't just defending herself, she was making it clear that this was bigger than a missing wallet. It was about principles, dignity, and accountability. And she wasn't about to back down. The tension in the first-class cabin had reached an almost unbearable peak. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting between Amara, the businessman, and Captain Hartley. The weight of accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The flight attendant, visibly shaken, hesitated before stepping forward. Her hands trembled slightly as she addressed Amara. Ma'am, if you don't mind, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll need to check your belongings. Amara followed the scent of blood, something she wasn't used to. Amara's gaze shifted to the young woman, her expression calm but unyielding. Go ahead, she said, her tone neutral. She wasn't about to create a scene, but she also wasn't going to let this situation unfold without addressing its underlying injustice. The attendant carefully opened Amara's bag, her movements slow and deliberate. The cabin fell eerily silent, save for the rustling of fabric and the occasional clink of items being moved. Amara remained still, her composed demeanor an anchor in the storm of tension swirling around her. After a few moments, the attendant straightened, a faint look of relief crossing her face. There's nothing here, she said, addressing both Hartley and the businessman. Her words carried a finality that should have ended the matter. But instead of offering an apology, the businessman looked flustered. "She could have hidden it somewhere else," he mumbled, though his tone lacked the conviction it had moments earlier. Hartley, standing rigidly at the center of the cabin, cleared his throat. "Let's keep things professional," he said, his voice louder than necessary. "This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about ensuring the safety and trust of everyone on this flight." Amara's patience had reached its limit. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and retrieved her ID badge. She held it up for all to see, the airline's logo glinting under the cabin lights. "Amara Johnson," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Public Relations Director." The businessman's face turned an immediate shade of crimson, and a wave of murmurs rippled through the cabin. Hartley's confident posture faltered for the first time. He blinked, then forced a nervous chuckle, attempting to mask his discomfort. "Well," he said, his voice tight, "this is unexpected." Amara's expression didn't waver. She fixed Hartley with a steady gaze, her tone calm but laden with authority. "What's unexpected, Captain," she said, her voice carrying through the cabin, "is the unprofessional manner in which you've handled this situation. You allowed baseless accusations to escalate, and you failed to conduct yourself with the fairness and respect your position demands." Passengers now openly stared at Hartley, some with raised eyebrows, others with disapproving frowns. The businessman looked as though he wanted to disappear into his seat, avoiding Amara's gaze entirely. Hartley straightened his jacket, his discomfort evident despite his attempts to maintain composure. "I was just doing my job," he said defensively. "We can't ignore potential threats." "If I am—" Amara raised an eyebrow. "Threats?" she repeated, her voice cool. "Or prejudices? If your job includes targeting passengers without cause, Captain, then I'd say there's a serious flaw in the way this airline is being represented. And as the person responsible for ensuring our brand's integrity, I can assure you that this incident will be addressed." Her words landed like a hammer, the weight of her authority undeniable. The flight attendant looked down, as though embarrassed to have been caught in the middle of such a spectacle. In the face of this lack of appeal, Luke grasped her reality in enough to keep her going through the crowds climbing the staircase to the platforms below. Amara placed her badge back into her pocket, sitting back in her seat with quiet poise. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, a mixture of support and indignation aimed at Hartley. The captain's face was a mask of suppressed frustration, but he said nothing further. The silence that followed wasn't one of resolution. It was the calm before the inevitable reckoning. Amara had made her position clear, and she knew that from this moment forward, things would never be the same for Captain Hartley or the airline she had worked so hard to uphold. The atmosphere in the cabin was tense, the kind of charged silence that felt louder than any argument. Amara sat back in her seat, her face calm but her mind alert. Around her, passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. The businessman, however, still refused to meet her gaze, his indignation now overshadowed by a flicker of doubt. The flight attendant, standing a few steps away, glanced nervously between Amara and Captain Hartley. Then, as if summoning a burst of courage inspired by Amara's composure, she bent down, her hands carefully searching around the businessman's seat. Her fingers skimmed the floor and reached further under the seat cushion. It took only a moment for her to freeze. Her hand paused, and when she sat back up, she held something small and familiar, a wallet. She inspected it briefly before standing, holding it up for the businessman to see. "Sir," she said, her voice louder now, more confident, "I believe this might belong to you." The businessman's face turned a deep shade of crimson as the realization hit him. He leaned forward, snatching the wallet from her hands and quickly flipping through it, as though confirming it was indeed his. His mouth opened and closed a few times before he managed to sputter, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to accuse anyone." The apology was half-hearted at best, and his embarrassment did little to ease the lingering tension in the cabin. Several passengers shot him disapproving looks, their gazes lingering before shifting to Captain Hartley, who now stood stiffly, his face unreadable, but his discomfort clear. Amara, ever composed, allowed herself the smallest of smiles, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. The truth always comes to light, she thought, her confidence unshaken. She straightened slightly, her posture radiating quiet authority. Quiet, that is, Captain McFarlane. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, some expressing disbelief, others voicing their frustration at how the situation had unfolded. A woman 2 rows back shook her head, muttering something about how unjustly Amara had been treated. A man across the aisle leaned over to his seatmate, whispering, "You could see it on her face. She knew she was innocent." The businessman cleared his throat awkwardly, shoving the wallet into his pocket. He started, looking around the cabin but avoiding Amara's gaze. "I guess it must have fallen. I didn't mean to." Amara's gaze didn't waver as she looked at him, her expression steady but unreadable. She said nothing, allowing the weight of the moment to speak for itself. The flight attendant, clearly emboldened by the turn of events, stepped closer to Amara and offered a small, apologetic nod. Amara returned it with a brief but meaningful glance, acknowledging her role in diffusing the situation. Meanwhile, Captain Hartley remained rooted in place, his lips pressed into a thin line. His earlier confidence had been replaced by an air of quiet defensiveness, as though he was grappling with how to salvage the situation. The passengers' shifting gazes were no longer on the businessman. They were on him. Amara's internal thoughts remained calm and collected. She leaned back slightly, her hands resting on the armrests of her seat. "This isn't just about me," she thought. "It's about how people choose to use their power. And it's about accountability." The cabin, though quieter now, was far from settled. The businessman had retrieved his wallet, but the damage was done. Trust in Hartley's authority had been shaken, and Marara's quiet composure had left an indelible mark on everyone watching. For the first time since his departure, Artemis had been on his own, and Marara solemnly wished him well back to peace. For now, the immediate crisis was resolved, but Amara knew this flight was far from over. The real reckoning was still ahead. The wallet's return should have marked the end of the ordeal, but the unease in the first-class cabin lingered like a storm cloud refusing to clear. Passengers settled back into their seats, but the whispers continued, eyes darting toward Captain Hartley and the businessman who had yet to fully recover from his public embarrassment. Amara remained poised, her expression calm but her senses alert. She knew the situation had shifted, but she wasn't naive. The undercurrent of tension was still present, and she could feel the weight of Captain Hartley's gaze. He had lost control of the narrative, and his frustration was palpable. Near the front of the cabin, Hartley stood stiffly, his back partially turned toward the passengers. His jaw clenched as he muttered under his breath, barely audible but dripping with disdain. "She thinks she's untouchable." The flight attendant standing nearby hesitated, her eyes wide with worry. She glanced toward Amara, then back at Hartley, as if weighing whether to intervene. "Captain," she said softly, her voice low enough that only he could hear, "maybe we should let it go. This is getting out of hand." Hartley snapped his head toward her, his expression sharp and impatient. "I know exactly what I'm doing," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. The flight attendant flinched, clearly unnerved by his tone, but she didn't press further. She stepped back slightly, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze downcast. Hartley's frustration simmered just below the surface. To him, Amara's calm defiance was an affront to his authority, a challenge he couldn't ignore. He glanced toward the cockpit, his mind already formulating a plan. If she wanted to test him, He would remind her who held the power on this flight. In the cabin, Amara could feel the tension radiating from Hartley even without looking directly at him. Her instincts warned her that he wasn't finished. She had seen men like him before, those who mistook authority for dominance, who couldn't handle being questioned, much less proven wrong. She remained still, her fingers lightly resting on the armrests, her expression one of quiet confidence. Passengers, meanwhile, continued to exchange uneasy glances. A woman seated across the aisle leaned toward her companion. "I don't like the way this feels," she murmured. "He's not letting it go." Hartley turned back toward the cabin, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed his intent. He strode past Amara's seat without looking at her, his movements sharp and deliberate. Reaching the intercom near the cockpit, he pressed a button, his voice echoing through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone forced but firm. "We've encountered a minor security issue that requires us to adjust our course. Please remain seated as we ensure the safety and well-being of everyone on board. Your cooperation is appreciated." The Rolo was a tall, beautiful man with silvery brown hair and blue eyes. The announcement sent a ripple of confusion through the cabin. Passengers looked around, their expressions puzzled. Amara's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind immediately registering the shift. This wasn't about safety. This was retaliation. The flight attendant approached Hartley again, her steps tentative. "Captain," she said quietly, her voice trembling, "are you sure this is necessary? We've already resolved the issue." Hartley silenced her with a sharp glance. "It's protocol," he said curtly, his tone brooking no argument. "Stay in your lane." Travis Crunchy snapped a dark look himself, but didn't respond. Amara caught the exchange, her sharp gaze taking in every detail. She leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable, but her mind racing. Hartley's actions were escalating, and she knew she needed to stay ahead of him. As the plane began to suddenly shift course, the unease in the cabin deepened. Amara sat still, her composure unshaken, but inside she was already preparing for the next move. Whatever Hartley had planned, she wouldn't let him succeed unchecked. The battle wasn't over, it was just beginning. The subtle shift in the plane's trajectory was almost imperceptible at first, but Amara noticed it immediately. She felt the slight adjustment in the aircraft's movement, and a quiet ripple of confusion spread among the passengers. Whispers filled the cabin, accompanied by glances toward the windows and the overhead announcement lights. Captain Hartley's voice crackled through the intercom, breaking the uneasy murmurs. His tone was polished, but there was an undercurrent of tension he couldn't quite mask. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his words measured and deliberate, "we'll be experiencing a slight delay as we adjust our route for safety reasons. Please remain seated and follow the instructions of the crew. We appreciate your understanding and cooperation." Amara's grip on the armrest tightened slightly. Her instincts flared. This isn't about safety, she thought, her sharp mind already dissecting his announcement. He's retaliating. The passengers exchanged puzzled glances, their earlier tension returning. A man in the back of the cabin leaned forward to whisper to his seatmate, "What safety issue? Everything seemed fine." Mara's gaze remained steady, her composure unbroken, but internally, her thoughts were racing. She knew exactly what this was. Captain Hartley was leveraging his authority to punish her for standing her ground, escalating a situation that had already been resolved. The flight attendant from earlier approached her quietly, her face pale with worry. She leaned in slightly, speaking just above a whisper. "Ma'am, I think Captain Hartley has requested airport security to meet us upon landing." Amara's stomach tightened, though her face betrayed no emotion. She looked up at the young woman, her voice calm but firm. "Did he say why?" The attendant glanced nervously over her shoulder, then back at Amara. "He mentioned a potential security breach." Amara let out a slow breath, her jaw tightening. A security breach, she thought. her mind turning the phrase over with a mixture of anger and disbelief. It was a vague accusation, deliberately inflammatory, designed to justify extreme measures. She knew exactly what Hartley was doing, weaponizing fear and protocol to target her. Across the cabin, passengers were growing restless. "What kind of safety issue?" a woman near the front asked a passing flight attendant. "Is something wrong with the plane?" "No, ma'am," the attendant replied quickly, her tone reassuring but strained. "It's nothing to worry about. Please remain seated." Amara leaned back slightly, her gaze fixed on the cockpit door. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some curious, others wary. The businessman from earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding her gaze entirely. The plane's descent began sooner than expected, the slight lurch forward drawing surprised murmurs from the passengers. Amara remained still, her calm exterior masking the storm brewing inside her. She had faced challenges before, but this was different. Hartley wasn't just trying to assert his authority. He was attempting to discredit her entirely. As the runway came into view, Amara's mind sharpened. Stay composed. They'll see through this. She was no stranger to high-stakes confrontations, and she knew that her calm demeanor and sharp intellect were her greatest assets. The plane touched down with a jolt, the runway lights streaking past the windows. Hartley's voice returned to the intercom, his tone clipped and professional. "Thank you for your patience, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be taxiing to a secure area shortly. Please remain seated until further instructions are provided." The tension in the cabin was now palpable. Amara folded her hands in her lap, her gaze steady as she prepared herself for what was to come. Hartley had made his move, but she wasn't about to let him win. Whatever he had planned, she was ready. The plane came to a halt on a remote section of the tarmac, far from the terminal and other activity. The passengers, already unsettled by the unexpected landing, exchanged wary glances, their confusion evident. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the low murmur of conversation turned into uneasy whispers. Outside, a pair of airport security vehicles approached, their lights flashing but sirens mercifully silent. Amara remained seated, her expression calm but resolute. She could feel the weight of Captain Hartley's gaze even without looking toward the cockpit. This was his attempt to make her appear small, powerless. But she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. The flight attendant from earlier approached her again, her face pale. "Ma'am," she said softly, "the captain has requested that you disembark first. Security will meet you outside." Mara met the woman's eyes, her voice steady. "Thank you. I'll handle it from here." Rising from her seat, she adjusted her blazer and retrieved her bag. As she stepped into the aisle, she felt the eyes of the other passengers following her. Some looked confused, others uneasy. A few offered sympathetic glances, silently acknowledging the injustice they had witnessed. Walking to the exit, Amara's steps were measured and deliberate. Each one felt like a declaration that she was in control of the situation, no matter what Hartley had planned. The captain stood near the open door, his expression unreadable, but his posture rigid. She passed him without a word, her head held high. The hot tarmac air hit her as she stepped out of the aircraft. Two security officers approached quickly, their expressions professional but curious. The lead officer, a tall man with a badge glinting under the sun, held up a hand to stop her. "Miss, we need to speak with you." Mara cut him off with a calm but firm tone, pulling out her ID badge and holding it up before he could finish. Amara Johnson, Public Relations Director for this airline. Her voice carried the weight of authority, her words slicing through the moment like a knife. "And unless you're here to escort me to a terminal lounge, I suggest you stand down." The officer froze, his eyes darting to her badge, and his face quickly shifted to one of surprise and nervousness. "Miss Johnson," he stammered, his voice now tinged with deference, "we didn't realize." "Save it," she said curtly, cutting him off again. "I'll be speaking to your supervisor later about this debacle. For now, stand aside." The second officer glanced at his partner, visibly unsure of how to proceed. Reluctantly, they both stepped back, the lead officer murmuring an awkward apology. "Of course, Miss Johnson." Amara didn't wait for further acknowledgement. She walked past them, her stride confident, her mind already formulating the next steps. From the corner of her eye, she caught sight of Captain Hartley standing at the aircraft door, watching the scene unfold. His expression was a mixture of frustration and disbelief, the cracks in his plan now glaringly evident. For a moment their eyes met. Amara's gaze was steady, unyielding, a silent reminder that she wasn't someone to be underestimated. Hartley's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, the weight of his actions finally settling on him. As she reached the edge of the tarmac, Amara paused briefly, drawing a deep breath. This wasn't just about setting the record straight. It was about holding people accountable, about ensuring that actions like Hartley's had consequences. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and continued forward, ready for the conference room. Hartley's plan might have gotten her off the plane, but it had also set the stage for his undoing. The conference room was sterile and quiet, the kind of place meant to stifle emotion and command formality. Amara entered with measured steps, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. The room was sparsely furnished, a long table, a few chairs, and a single window overlooking the tarmac. Captain Hartley was already there, standing stiffly at the far end of the table. He turned as she entered, his face betraying a mixture of frustration and unease. The tension in the air was immediate, thick enough to cut. Amara set her bag on a chair and stood, her posture composed, her presence commanding. Hartley, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence noticeably shaken. "Captain Hartley," she began, her voice steady and professional, "we need to discuss your actions today." Hartley bristled, his arms crossing defensively over his chest. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said quickly, his voice strained. "She provoked me. I was just doing my job." Mara's eyes narrowed slightly, her calm composure unbroken. "Your job," she said, her tone sharp but measured, "is to ensure the safety and comfort of your passengers and crew. Today, you failed at both." Hartley opened his mouth to retort but faltered under her steady gaze. He began. But Amara didn't let him finish. "No, Captain," she interrupted, her voice firm and unyielding. "This was not a misunderstanding. You abused your power. You allowed your personal biases to dictate your actions, and in doing so, you jeopardized the safety and trust of everyone on board." Hartley's face reddened, and his frustration began to bubble to the surface. "I was following protocol," he snapped, his voice rising. "There was a security concern. I couldn't ignore it." Amara didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step closer, her calm demeanor only intensifying the pressure in the room. "A misplaced wallet is not a security breach," she said, her words precise and cutting. "And targeting me without evidence, forcing an unnecessary landing, summoning security to detain me, was not protocol. It was a personal vendetta." Hartley's jaw tightened and he glanced away, his bravado crumbling under her scrutiny. "I didn't," he started, but his words faltered. Eliza's eyes narrowed, and she breathed a sigh of relief. Mara tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Let me be clear, Captain," she said, her tone softening but retaining its edge. "Your actions today were not only unprofessional but dangerous. You disrupted a flight, humiliated a passenger, and eroded trust in your leadership. That is not something I can or will ignore." Hartley's shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time, his defensiveness gave way to something resembling regret. He sank into a chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I made a mistake," he admitted, though his voice was barely above a whisper. Amara didn't let up. "A mistake," she said, her tone carrying the weight of authority, "is something we all make. But this wasn't just a mistake, Captain. This was a deliberate misuse of power, and there will be consequences." "That's messy," Left said. The silence that followed was deafening. Hartley avoided her gaze, his earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. Amara remained standing, her composure unwavering, the weight of her words lingering in the air. "Abres en serpiere." "I will be filing a full report," she continued, her voice steady. "And I expect your full cooperation during the investigation. This airline has no room for leaders who prioritize ego over responsibility." Hartley nodded stiffly, though he said nothing. The fight had drained from him, replaced by the reality of the situation. Amara straightened, her presence commanding, even in silence. The confrontation wasn't about punishment, it was about accountability, and today she had ensured that Captain Hartley understood exactly what that meant. The atmosphere in the conference room shifted palpably as the door opened, and James Delacroix, the CEO of the airline, entered. His presence was commanding but calm, his tailored suit immaculate, and his expression betraying a simmering anger that he expertly kept in check. The room immediately quieted as he took his place at the head of the table, setting his briefcase down with a deliberate thud. James Delacroix surveyed the room, his sharp eyes first landing on Captain Hartley, whose earlier bravado had all but vanished. Hartley fidgeted in his seat, his face a mix of defensiveness and unease. Then Delacroix's gaze shifted to Amara, who stood poised and composed, a silent picture of professionalism. The contrast between the two could not have been starker. "I've been briefed on the situation," Delacroix began, his voice measured but carrying an unmistakable edge. "And I have to say, I'm deeply disappointed." Hartley opened his mouth to speak, but Delacroix held up a hand, cutting him off. "I'm not here to hear excuses, Captain," he said coldly. "I'm here to understand how this company's reputation and operational integrity were so carelessly jeopardized." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Delacroix turned to Amara first. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his tone softening slightly. "You've handled this situation with a level of professionalism that I can only commend. Thank you for your composure during what I can only imagine was an unacceptable ordeal. Another of these excesses, I suppose, you'll have to pay for." Mara inclined her head slightly, her voice calm and even. "Thank you, Mr. Delacroix. I trust that the necessary steps will be taken to address this matter." "May it please the court," said Delacroix. Delacroix nodded before shifting his attention back to Hartley. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as his focus landed on the captain. "Captain Hartley," he said, his voice colder now, "your actions today were not only unprofessional but reckless, diverting a flight for a fabricated security issue, humiliating a senior member of our staff. Do you have any idea what kind of liability this creates for the company?" Hartley sat up straighter, attempting to regain some semblance of control. "Sir," he began, his voice wavering slightly, "I was just doing my job. There was a situation, and I acted in the interests of safety." "No, you weren't," Delacroix snapped, cutting him off with a sharpness that left no room for argument. "You weren't acting in the interests of safety. You were acting on personal bias and misplaced authority, and in doing so you jeopardized the trust and safety of our passengers, our staff, and this company." "Stop staring at me," March said. Hartley's mouth opened and closed, as if searching for the right words, but nothing came. His confidence had evaporated under the weight of Delacroix's words, leaving him floundering. Delacroix didn't wait for a response. "Effective immediately," he said, his tone final and unyielding. "You are suspended. There will be a full investigation into your actions, and I expect your complete cooperation. If you fail to comply, or if the investigation confirms what I already suspect, you will face permanent termination." Hartley's face went pale. But, he stammered, his voice faltering. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was following protocol." He barrowed past Brandon, trying to speed up his progress. "No, you weren't," Delacqua interrupted again, his voice rising slightly. "You were following your ego. And let me be very clear, Captain. This airline has no room for leaders who abuse their authority." The silence that followed was deafening. Hartley slumped back in his chair, the fight drained from him. Delacqua turned to Amara once more, his expression softening. "Ms. Johnson," he said, "please rest assured that this matter will be handled thoroughly. Your efforts to maintain professionalism throughout this incident have not gone unnoticed." Amara nodded, her voice calm but resolute. "Thank you, Mr. Delacqua. I trust that we'll take the steps necessary to prevent this from happening again." Delacqua gave a curt nod before gathering his papers and standing. "This meeting is adjourned," he said, his tone leaving no room for further discussion. As he exited the room, the weight of his decisions hung heavily in the air, a clear reminder of the consequences of abusing power within the company. The trooper was halfway to Greg's offense when Delacqua gave him a final wave and wrapped up. The days following the confrontation were a whirlwind of meetings, emails, and phone calls. Amara wasted no time stepping into action, determined to turn the incident into a catalyst for meaningful change. The incident with Captain Hartley was not an isolated problem. It was a symptom of deeper systemic issues within the company's culture, and Amara was committed to addressing them head-on. Seated in the conference room with her leadership team, Amara spoke with the same confidence and clarity that had defined her during the ordeal. "We need to ensure no one like Hartley is allowed to thrive in this company again," she began, her voice firm and resolute. "This isn't just about one person's behavior. It's about the environment that allowed it to happen in the first place." Her team nodded in agreement, their expressions a mix of determination and concern. Amara outlined her vision with precision. "Here's what we're going to do," she said, picking up a marker and writing key points on the whiteboard behind her. "First, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for every employee, no exceptions. Second, a comprehensive review of our reporting systems to ensure that employees at all levels feel safe bringing forward concerns. And third, a complete overhaul of our leadership evaluation process." One of her colleagues, a senior HR representative, raised a hand hesitantly. "Amara, implementing these changes on such a large scale will take time and resources. How do we prioritize?" Amara's gaze was unwavering. "We prioritize by understanding that our reputation and the trust of our passengers and employees is on the line. We can't afford not to act swiftly and decisively." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "This isn't optional. This is about protecting the integrity of our company and ensuring that every person who steps onto one of our planes feels respected and valued." Later that week, Amara stood in front of a larger group of employees, her posture commanding yet approachable. The room was filled with people from various departments, pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, and corporate staff, all gathered to hear her address the situation. "This isn't just about one person," Amara said, her voice steady but passionate. "This is about a culture that must change. Captain Hartley's actions were unacceptable, but they didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened because our systems allowed them to. That's on all of us, and it's our responsibility to ensure it doesn't happen again." She paused, scanning the room, her gaze meeting several individuals who nodded in silent agreement. "We will be transparent about this process," she continued. "That means holding ourselves accountable, even when it's uncomfortable. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over the group. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began, growing louder as more employees joined in. Amara felt a swell of pride, not for herself, but for the team and the company she believed in. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one rooted in accountability and respect. As the meeting ended, a junior flight attendant approached her hesitantly. "Thank you, Miss Johnson," she said quietly, "for standing up. It means a lot to all of us." Amara offered a warm smile. "Thank you," she replied. "This is just the start. Together, we'll make sure this company lives up to the standards it should." Walking back to her office, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was confident in the direction they were headed. Change was coming, and it would be driven by accountability, transparency, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The press conference room buzzed with anticipation, cameras flashing as reporters whispered among themselves. The incident involving Captain Hartley had already made headlines, and everyone was eager to hear how the airline planned to address it. Amara stood just behind the podium, reviewing her notes one last time. She had carefully crafted her statement, knowing this was her opportunity to demonstrate the company's accountability and commitment to change. As the room settled, Amara stepped up to the podium, her presence commanding. She scanned the audience, her gaze steady and unflinching, before leaning slightly into the microphone. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "Thank you all for being here today. As you know, an incident occurred on one of our flights earlier this week, an incident that should never have happened." She then continued with anxiety written on her face. The room went silent, all eyes fixed on her as the weight of her words sank in. "Let me start by saying this. We take full responsibility for what happened," she continued, her tone firm but empathetic. "The actions of one individual do not define who we are as a company, but they do reflect areas where we must do better. And we will." Her words were direct, but her sincerity was unmistakable. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras capturing every moment as Amara spoke with conviction. "At this airline, we are committed to ensuring that every passenger and every employee is treated with dignity and respect," she said, her voice carrying through the room. "What occurred was a failure to uphold those values, and for that we sincerely apologize. To those directly affected, and to everyone who places their trust in us." She paused, letting the gravity of her apology settle. Then, her tone shifted slightly, becoming more resolute. "But apologies are not enough. Action is what matters." Amara glanced at her notes briefly before continuing, her voice gaining momentum. "Effective immediately, we are implementing a series of reforms aimed at addressing the underlying issues that contributed to this incident. These include mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, a thorough review of our leadership evaluation processes, and the establishment of an anonymous reporting system to ensure every voice is heard." Her gaze swept the room, her confidence unwavering. "These steps are only the beginning. We understand that real change takes time and continuous effort. But let me be clear, we are fully committed to making that change." A hand shot up in the audience. "Miss Johnson," a reporter called, "what measures are being taken regarding Captain Hartley?" The woman looked. Mara's expression didn't waver. "Captain Hartley has been suspended pending a full investigation," she said firmly. "We are following due process to ensure accountability at every level. His actions were unacceptable and do not reflect the standards we hold ourselves to." Another reporter called out, "How can passengers trust your airline after this?" Amara met the question head-on. "By proving ourselves through our actions," she replied. "Trust is earned, not given. We understand that, and we are prepared to do the work required to restore that trust." She straightened, her final words carrying the weight of her commitment. This isn't just about repairing our reputation. It's about reaffirming our values and ensuring that everyone, passengers and employees alike, feels safe, respected, and valued. We owe that to them, and we will deliver. As she stepped back from the podium, the room erupted in questions, but Amara remained calm. She had delivered the message with clarity and strength, knowing it was the first step in rebuilding trust. Walking out of the room, she felt the burden of responsibility, but also the determination to see her plans through. Change was coming, and it started here. The office was quiet as Amara stood by the large window, watching the planes taxi across the tarmac. The city skyline shimmered in the distance, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. It had been weeks since the incident, but the ripple effects were still being felt throughout the airline. Meetings, new policies, and training programs were now the order of the day, all aimed at addressing the systemic flaws that had been exposed. A notification pinged on her tablet, the latest progress report on the company's diversity and inclusion initiatives. Amara opened it, scanning the data with a critical eye. Participation in the mandatory training sessions was high, and feedback from employees showed a mix of relief and cautious optimism. The anonymous reporting system had already begun receiving submissions, revealing issues that had long gone unaddressed. Each step, though small, felt significant. A piece of the foundation for the culture she envisioned. Amara closed the report, her reflection faintly visible in the window. Her thoughts drifted back to the press conference, to the flight, to Captain Hartley's defensive words. The memory no longer stung. Instead, it fueled her resolve. She knew that the work ahead was immense, but she also knew that transformation was never easy. It was messy, slow, and often met with resistance. Yet it was necessary. This isn't the end, she thought to herself, her expression resolute. It's just the beginning of creating a safer, more respectful workplace for everyone. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. A junior manager peeked in, holding a printed memo. "Miss Johnson," he said, his tone reverent, "the CEO asked me to share this with you. It's about the feedback from the pilot training program. He also wanted me to thank you personally for leading this effort." Johnson looked up when he saw the Deputy Director of Middle Eastern Affairs, and the quality of the reply to the manager was impressive. Not just for casual talk about the pilot training program. He also wanted me to share this with you. It's about the feedback from the pilot training program. He also wanted me to share this with you. It's about the feedback from the pilot training program for leading this effort. Amara took the memo, offering him a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you," she said. As he left, she skimmed the document, noting the positive remarks from employees who felt heard and valued for the first time in years. These small victories weren't just checkboxes on a corporate agenda. They were tangible signs of change. As the day turned to dusk, Amara allowed herself a moment of reflection. The journey hadn't been easy, and it was far from over. But she could already see the seeds of transformation taking root. Employees who had once felt silenced were speaking up. Processes that had long been stagnant were now under scrutiny. And most importantly, there was a growing sense of accountability that couldn't be ignored. The phone on her desk buzzed, a reminder of another meeting scheduled to discuss progress on the anonymous reporting system. Amara picked it up, her mind already shifting to the next task. But before heading out, she took one last glance at the tarmac, watching as another plane lifted into the sky. Her reflection in the glass mirrored her resolve, confident, determined, a leader standing at the helm of change, ensuring that the lessons learned from this experience would shape the future, not just for the airline, but for everyone who walked through its doors. Director Chris Palmer pleased past guests safely onto the floors and left them safe. As she turned to leave the office, a quiet sense of fulfillment washed over her. The challenges ahead didn't intimidate her, they inspired her. and as she stepped into the next chapter of her journey, she carried with her the unwavering belief that every step forward, no matter how small, was worth taking. Amara Johnson wasn't just changing an airline. She was setting a standard, a legacy of respect and inclusion that would echo far beyond the walls of the company, a legacy no one would forget.